Well, welcome back again, Malcolm. Thanks for staying for part two. Uh,
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
all right. This time we're going to talk about your solo album Patterns, another fantastic piece of music.
Thank you.
This is the kind that you sit back, put the headphones on, get comfortable, and just enjoy. Uh,
Mhm.
Tell us about the inspiration and what you're trying to achieve. And
Yeah, I've always had an interest both in the rock side of music and also in more classical um, music. I started off tuba was my classical instrument at school, and I did you know grades and music A level, but uh, contemporary classical music was usually the part of classical music I was most interested in, and particularly the minimalists. And of the minimalists, particularly Steve Reich, although he doesn't like the word minimalists, but uh, the, the kind of music that came about, I suppose, in the 1970s, where they brought back in the pulse and consonance into classical music, which, I think dissonance and complexity are perfectly valid um, compositional tools, but I don't think they're the only sounds that are legitimate. And in contemporary music at the time, on the classical side, unless something was uh, unlikely to be enjoyed by anybody other than a very, very small group of people who were particularly into the very academic classical music, it wasn't seen as serious. And that the American minimalists, I think, really changed that by bringing back in consonance and pulse. So I like that now as a composer, you've got a huge range of different sound worlds that you can dip into without it just being, oh, you can only be using this particular technique if you are a serious composer. So somebody like Reich, what I really like are the intricacy of these um, relatively simple patterns with repetition, but that in combination with other patterns, particularly patterns that have slightly different length, you develop these emergent patterns out of uh, the interaction of simpler elements. That reminds me of, uh, say, like in developmental biology. I did some developmental biology as a degree while I was doing my medical training, and the way that in nature very complex patterns can develop from the interaction of actually relatively simple processes. And these can lead to these emergent patterns that are, hugely complex and impressive, but from very simple building blocks. And that appeals to me. And that's why the title patterns, I think the interaction of patterns to create more complex structures is something that really appeals.
well, excellent. Um, Kites and Darts starts out like falling rain, and here in Washington, we definitely know about it. You guys know about that very well. Was that kind of the idea, or
Sorry,
well,
could you say that again? Well, at the beginning, I didn't catch what you said at the beginning. Kites and darts starts with.
it almost sounds like the kind of rain that we have out here in Washington, and I know you have in England.
All right. I hadn't thought of that, but could be. Yeah.
What was your
Um, the title is a reference to Penrose tiling, which is a mathematical type of way of covering a surface with patterns that don't repeat but look similar. So although I've not used those techniques to actually make the music, the idea of patterns that from a distance look like they're simple and repeated, but actually when you look in detail are ever changing appeals. That was the influence of the title. Um, for these pieces, generally there isn't a story in the narrative sense like there is with the classical side of the things I do with Hats Off. Um, it's more an ebb and flow and shaping of, and often there'll be instruments will gradually come in and then gradually fade out, and the elements that contribute to the texture gradually changes. Um, there are some more jumps where things change more abruptly, but generally, what I'm aiming for is if you weren't actually thinking about it, it would sound like nothing much is changing. But then, actually, if you looked over a longer period of time, a lot has changed, but it's imperceptible.
Yeah.
That's the kind
And
of thing I'm
you
often
can,
aiming at. Because,
and you can sense that throughout this album. You know, the longer you listen to it, like you say, the more you see the subtle changes.
mm.
How
It's also,
about
I think, it's about listening with headphones. I mean, it's certainly written with headphones in mind. I mean, there's a lot of stuff where instruments, the pattern of which instruments are in which part of the audio space, actually being part of the pattern, the spatial patterns as well as pitch patterns. And I think that's easier to hear with headphones than with a standard speakers, probably.
probably not one you take with you in the car, but you never know. It's soothing. It is. Most of it is very soothing.
Yeah, I mean, it has the advantage of not having me shouting during it, which it's fun for when I'm, on stage doing the songs that have got vocals. But I can understand that words can be quite intrusive sometimes if you're having. I mean, some people are very much against background music. I think I like music to be used however the person wants to use it, and you if you're lying down at night with your eyes closed, you might want to listen to something that doesn't have words.
Or yeah, no, you're right. Just something to relax to and have your own time.
And
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
I do appreciate, I mean, the kind of themes that appeal to me as a lyricist tend not to be particularly relaxing or joyful themes, unfortunately. I mean, I think I think it's very difficult to write a good, happy song. I mean, it's not something that I necessarily would be able to do. And, I do have great respect for those who can. It's harder than it looks. But I do also like writing music that's a bit less, a bit more, no, what's the word? Bit less bleak. Uh, some of the minimalist instrumental stuff, it's kind of able to be sometimes quite joyful, I think, because it doesn't have to fit the narrative that most more concept-based albums we do with Hats Off. We need stuff that fits the kind of story of where the album's going. Here, I think I've got that kind of freedom to be quite playful. I mean, to be fair, I have a lot of freedom in Hats Off as well. I mean, with where I do that, obviously I wouldn't want to put anything in an album that Mark didn't approve of, but we've never had that as an issue between us before. We've always so far entirely agreed on everything, but they tend to have a theme or a story, and so you've got some constraint of wanting to fit that narrative, and the type of narratives I've tended to go for haven't tended to be ones that would really fit
And
soothing and fun.
this frees you up, allows you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
And also for these, I mean, some of the bits in my solo things, I imagine might fit on a Hats Off album as a kind of a short transition between us, two songs, whereas on the solo albums they get maybe half an hour to develop more fully in a way that it's difficult really to justify on a primarily rock album. Yeah.
Well, now we can go track by track, or do
Sure.
you want to? You
Well,
want to talk
whatever you
about?
fancy.
Do you want to talk about your favorite tracks?
Um,
We can do it either way.
um, Feel free to prompt me the track name, and I'll see what I can remember about it.
All right,
It's a very long album.
it is. Yeah, you definitely, and that's one thing that I will say, and I think I've said it in my review. You always get your money's worth. You
Yes,
plenty of music, and it's good music. It's not.
thank you.
There's none of it is throwaway. It's all very good and well worth listening to.
Thank you.
Pattern Jugglers.
Oh yeah, that's one of the kind of fairly upbeat, fun ones. I like that. That also brings in a little bit, I think, of drums, and has it's also got a little bit of a connection to Nostalgia for Infinity, in that had quite a few tracks that were inspired by the books by Alistair Reynolds. Pattern Jugglers was the name he gave to a sort of dispersed mind species in a sea, and that idea of this kind of floating components of a mind that are constantly interacting is what inspired that piece. Yeah.
Spiral sounds pretty simple, but
Yeah, so that one is pretty long, if I recall correctly, and it's I think it takes a very, very simple initial pattern, but that's one of the, I think, more sort of hardcore minimalist pieces on the album, in that it's a very simple pattern that very gradually changes. So I don't think any two bars in the album would be identical, but the change is very subtle. And I quite understand that many people might not fancy it. That's so okay. But I think if you go into it with the right kind of, well, if you've got the mindset where you quite like the idea of focusing on these very tiny changes over a prolonged period, I could see it as being quite a mindful type thing, or really irritating if you're not in the mood for it. I could imagine also.
How about Shelter?
So there are a couple of tracks on the album that are more sort of contemporary, classical, not so minimalist. So these ones tend to have sustained atonal strings with instruments gradually fading in and out, overlapping, changing chords, and then little sprinkles of stabs of tuned percussion or piano or harp. So that one, the word shelter, and it implies a place of refuge and safety, but it's also, to me, an ambiguous word, because it also implies the need to shelter from something. So there is an external threat. So it's aiming at that ambiguity of a sort of uncomfortable piece, if that sort of kind of makes sense. I don't think until the very end it's ever really settled, but it's also not as unpleasant in terms of astringent atonal sounds as you might expect, given that it's an atonal piece.
All right, Lighthouse.
That's a very short new one. I mean, so about half an hour of the material is newly released pieces, and the rest is a retrospective of previous compositions. Lighthouse is a new one, and I must admit the title doesn't particularly mean anything other than it just felt a bit like that. But yeah, the title came afterwards. It's more it's a fairly simple kind of minimalist one, and one of the very few tracks on there that could plausibly fit on like a radio program or a podcast. I think it's only about a minute and a half, which is quite unusual for my minimalist pieces, which tend to go on and on and on and on.
All right. What about WASP 76b?
So that's named after an exoplanet, which I think at the time was thought to have liquid metal rain.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that's another fairly energetic. There's a sense of burbling patterns of the atmosphere going on in it. I think I quite like that one. I think that's fun and playful.
All right. Have you ever heard Eddie Jobson's Green album?
So,
Have you ever heard Eddie Jobson's Green album?
don't think so.
Sometime
But if you send
listen.
me any links of names of people you think I should try, I'm very open-minded.
Yeah, I think you'd like this. You know who Eddie Jobson is. He was in part of Jethro Tull. He was part of
Oh, right.
a
Okay.
number of bands, but he did some of his own solo work. And probably the Green album is what everyone points to as one of his. But I think you'd like that. I mean, he does similar with these patterns, and does have lyrics on some of the songs. There's even a song that some people would call pop, but excellent. Yeah, but I see a lot of that in Larry Fast. You've heard of Larry Fast, I'm sure, and Alan Parsons. Little bit of crossover there. Um, anyway, I just thought I'd mention. What do you think of those kind of comparisons? Or
I suspect that for my classical side, because I mean, I think I've probably got better at doing it over time, but I've been doing that kind of minimalist music since I was a teenager, and not necessarily recording it, but that kind of aesthetic, and that came very much from the American that first wave of American classical minimalists like Steve Reich. I suspect quite a lot of prog musicians may have been influenced by that group of composers or by other musicians who were influenced by that group of composers. And then we may be doing stuff that sounds somewhat similar, but probably it's because we've got a similar inspiration starting point rather than that I've heard those. I mean, I think when I was younger, it was predominantly classical music that I was listening to. So that's been quite a major influence for me.
All right. How have both of the albums been received by people? I see tons of reviews, tons, but a lot of reviews on Facebook. Are both? Is there a lot of interest for both albums?
I've been very pleasantly surprised with how it's been going for me. It always comes as a bit of a shock when people are interested in what I'm knocking up. I'm not suggesting it's huge numbers, but it's really gratifying that there is an interested audience, and it is definitely growing. These albums have done far better in terms of distributors and sales, and also the reviews have been very supportive. So with the Hats Off stuff, with each album, it's just been getting more and more, and then each time we put out an album, we get more interest also in our back catalogue, which is gratifying. The minimalist stuff, I get interest in it from the prog world, not so much, or maybe I haven't worked out how to get it into the more kind of classical world, or maybe it's that the prog audience is nice and open-minded, and I've been really touched that a lot of people who've supported our Hats Off music have also joined me for the classical side of what I do. Yeah, it's been lovely having so lots of different parts of the world we've been getting interest from, and people buying CDs for the Hats Off stuff. Yeah, very, very grateful for all the support we've had.
How about touring? I know you've done a few shows, um, and I think there's that show. And well, you tell me what kind of festivals and headline shows.
Well, it's been very nice that we've been increasingly invited to some lovely festivals. We've played a few times for Hard Rock Hell, and yeah, many of the major prog festivals in the UK we've now done. That's been a real pleasure. We would love to do shows abroad. It's logistically more difficult because of Brexit, unfortunately. But yeah, we're certainly open to invitations for international shows. I mean, we've got our next things. We've got tomorrow going to Southampton on the south coast of England for our first gig there. Then we've got another one coming up near Cambridge, and then back in Oxford later in the year. And then we've got our own Prog the Forest that we co-organise with Chris Parkins, where that's a fundraiser for rainforest preservation. So it's a charity that buys land that's threatened and puts it in a charitable trust for both environmental protection and the benefit of the local communities. So that's
talk about who's going to be at that show.
we've got Amy Burks and the Emerald Dawn, and we got another Dawn, Corolla's band. She played a solo set last time that went down extremely well. She's bringing a full band, Corolla Bears group, and we'll play, and we've got other acts still in some negotiations, but that will be confirmed hopefully soon. And it's a real pleasure, the event for us, because we get to invite bands that we admire, and it's a really friendly, supportive environment for a good cause. So yeah, looking forward to that.
Definitely. What's next for you? I know you're always working on something.
Yeah, so we've always got a lot of songs in progress, or song ideas. So we have probably about 40 or 50 ideas for songs that we'll then decide which ones to finish off and make into the next album. We've got a variety of potential themes for future albums. We haven't decided which one next, but yeah, we're always open to inspiration for new songs. But yeah, there will be a 7th Hats Off album and a 7th solo album at some point.
Do you think next year?
Plausibly. The last one, and I think we've done, I mean, I've done, I think it's 12 albums.
You've been rattling them off,
Yeah, I think I've done 12 albums in about 10 years. Yeah. So roughly an album a year, I think, is a reasonable aspiration. But the confidence trick took a little bit more time because the songs are quite, a lot of the songs in that are quite complex, and I, I didn't want to rush it in the sense that sometimes you can have a song almost finished and you think it's almost there, but there's just a line or something in the lyrics that doesn't feel right, and then suddenly a few months later the right word comes into your mind, and so yeah, letting the songs mature a bit.
All right. Is there anything else that you would like to discuss that we haven't covered?
No, just thank you very much for all your support and encouragement. It does mean a lot. I really appreciate it.
Definitely. I have a feeling you're probably going to have something next year. I know, just
I
the
wouldn't be
pattern that you've
surprised.
kind of
Yeah.
said, you're prolific.
Yeah, thank you.
For sure. Well, hey, thank you very much, Malcolm. It's always great to talk with you.
My pleasure. Thank
Very
you very much.
intellectual, and appreciate all your time and effort. And
That's great.
keep making the great music.
Thank you.
And just good luck in your continued bright future. And thanks again for giving us time here at
Thank you so much.
Central.com.
Bye. Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.
Well, hold up.